so this is what I think Baldur's Gate 3 is going to look like on PS5 when it launches there in a few weeks' time. To try and get a sense of how the console version is going to look and feel, I decided to test the game on the big telly with a DualSense controller while shifting the graphics settings down to something more resembling a console presentation, even though it's frankly heartbreaking because I'd usually be running this game on max settings in ultra wide, but you know, we've all got our crosses to bear. Now, Larian have made this a little bit easy for me because they've included native DualSense support on the PC version. If you see a screenshot from the PC version running with a DualSense controller, you might well just assume it's from the PS5 version because all the buttons are represented properly on screen, which is great. What's not so great is that I didn't feel any haptic feedback or any vibration at all, really. I don't know if that's just a problem with my system, might be some weird and annoying configuration issue that's stopping things there. It is PC gaming after all. PC gaming is hell. And I was a little bit disappointed with that because I am eager to see how Larian might use the really granular haptic feedback that's available with the DualSense, if they use it at all. I wouldn't expect that the adaptive triggers would come into play too much, given that, you know, it's a party-based RPG and not a driving game or a game where you shoot guns. But you know, given that this is a game where you use a lot of environmental attacks, there's a lot of physics simulation, oil slicks, burning, caltrops, things smash into pieces. I can imagine a lot of uses for the haptic feedback that could come into play in a game like this. But as I say, it wasn't firing at all when I tested it on PC, so maybe that's something we're going to have to actually wait for PS5 code for to test. So that's a little bit disappointing. But apart from that, the DualSense was properly implemented. Now, in terms of how it looks, we've had to make a bunch of assumptions here, right? And I think we've made some very good assumptions based on how console ports of multi-platform games tend to be going in this generation, in terms of the settings they tend to employ. I watch a lot of Digital Foundry. The phrase, "this looks like it's running on the medium or medium high preset," comes up quite often. What we do know is that Larian are currently optimizing for targeting 60 FPS on PlayStation 5. We know that thanks to a recent PlayStation blog post. So with that in mind, we're thinking that we should expect some compromises in terms of the visual quality to be made to keep that frame rate consistently 60 FPS. Now, the PS5 and the Xbox are arguably custom-built PCs, right? They run on x86 hardware, but not quite, because they are custom chips that you can't just buy in a GPU and stick in a normal computer, okay? But roughly, and I'm basing this off a really good PC Games N article from 2020 about building the equivalent PC to a PS5, roughly the PS5 CPU is about equivalent to a Ryzen 7 3700X and an RX 5700 GPU. 16 gigabytes of very fast RAM that's shared between the GPU and the CPU. Now, you can't really map the PS5 spec to the equivalent PC spec one-to-one. You know, if nothing else, the PS5 doesn't have to run Windows underneath any game it runs. You know, so they're different machines, they're built for different things, but roughly that's about the equivalent. And what's interesting about that is that almost line for line, that pretty much hits the recommended specs for the PC version of the game as listed on Steam. Apart from the amount of memory available, which is probably going to be the big issue here when it comes to squeezing this game onto a PS5. 16 gigs of memory in total is generally going to be less than what's available to you on a decent gaming PC. Most decent gaming PCs will have at least 8 gigabytes of video RAM dedicated to the GPU, alongside 16 gigs of DDR3 or 4. Those are two separate pools that are combined a lot bigger than the 16 gig that's available to the PS5. And as time marches on, that gulf is only growing bigger. I mean, I've got a PC that's set up for video editing as well as gaming, so I've got like an absurd amount of RAM. But for example, I've got 64 gigabytes of system memory and 12 gigabytes of video RAM on a 3080 Ti. Compared to the PS5, that's a cavernous amount of memory, and I suspect that's going to turn into a big issue later on, but more on that later. So by modern standards, Baldur's Gate 3's requirements are reasonably modest, but it can still make a big computer sweat. So I think it's reasonable to assume that a few compromises are going to be made in order to output something resembling 4K at a consistent 60 FPS, and also to manage the fact that, as we've said, the PS5 just doesn't have as much memory available to it as your average gaming PC, or should I say a decent gaming PC would. Given the limited resources available on PS5, we're probably going to see a presentation roughly equivalent to the medium preset on PC, as I've said, probably with some tweaks here and there to bring the detail up where they can afford it. But generally, I think the medium preset is a good base assumption, as in I think the PS5 version will look at least this good or better. Now, reducing texture resolution is one surefire way of clawing back RAM, so I would expect that to be the main compromise on consoles. I think some resolution scaling is a given as well, given that they're going to want to leverage that to hit 60 FPS. They might even employ a custom dynamic resolution solution that isn't available in the PC settings, but AMD's FSR 1.0 is what's available to us there. It's a fairly good bet given how consoles are all based around AMD silicon, and they don't have access to NVIDIA's DLSS, which is also supported on the PC version. And that's what I prefer to use all the time when it's available, because it gives you a lot of headroom and it just looks fantastic. You can barely tell it's on if you use a quality setting. DLSS is miles and miles better than FSR 1.0, but as I say, it's not available on PS5 because the PS5 doesn't run NVIDIA hardware. And the same goes for the Xbox Series as well. It's all AMD hardware. They're practically the same fucking machine. It is interesting that as yet Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't have support for FSR 2.0, which is AMD's new version of their resolution scaling technology. And it's particularly interesting because there's built-in support for temporal anti-aliasing, which AMD say if your game supports temporal anti-aliasing, then it's a doddle to implement FSR 2.0 because they're very similar. I'm not a developer, I don't know how to code shit, so I'm just going by what AMD have said publicly. But on the subject of temporal anti-aliasing, I think that's a fairly good bet for the console version because it gives very good results. And we see it on console games all the time these days. It gives games that kind of that signature softness, the slight kind of smudging or haloing around objects during kind of fast motion. It's very much like a signature of console rendering these days. So I think that's probably a fairly good bet as well. So medium settings, medium texture resolution to claw back some of that memory, some form of resolution scaling, probably FSR 1.0 because that's what's implemented in the PC version, or maybe they might do FSR 2.0 or some kind of custom dynamic resolution thing, who knows, but it probably won't be native 4K is what I'm getting at. And also temporal anti-aliasing, and these things will give Baldur's Gate 3 on PS5 that console sort of softness that probably you only start to see when you get to a 55-inch screen or bigger, but it'll be there. So I think those are quite reasonable assumptions. I've had them sanity checked by a couple of kind of game dev people that I know who, for the most part, basically shrugged and went, yeah, I mean, your guess is as good as anyone's. So this is where I've ended up with my guesswork. I could be way off the mark. They might end up going native 4K and compromising the detail even further than this, or they might end up rendering internally at 1080p. There's an infinite amount of options that devs have at a code level that go way beyond what's available to the end user on PC. So this really is a massive guess. But as an aside, the options on PC are very extensive. There's a lot of tweaks you can do here as a PC player where you can decide exactly where the compromises are made in order to suit your system, your tolerances as a player. Now, the differences between my PC running it on max settings versus medium settings are not as pronounced as you might think. The game looks wonderful, even in its scaled back, slightly softer form, but you can see that higher settings just give you that much finer detail and going much further into the image as well. Faces are more porous, skin is more cracked and pockmarked, rock faces are more jagged and craggy, the lighting effects are just that much more refined. One thing I did turn up for this was the depth of field setting from Gaussian to circle, because that better reflects how lenses actually work, and I hate when simulated depth of field is just a Gaussian blur because it looks incredibly fake. But apart from that, everything else is just a medium preset, and as I said earlier, I reckon the PS5 version is probably going to look this good or better, and it does look pretty good. I'd be quite happy to go through the entire game with it looking like this. If you're looking for graphical, technical wizardry, I don't think this game looks phenomenal, but I think it looks great, and I think the art direction and the digital acting, can I just say, the animation, the motion capture in this game is actually incredible. There's a lot of really subtle performance work going on that's being captured very nicely. A lot of stuff that you just don't really get the finer motions for in a lot of games. The choices that actors make about twitching certain muscles in the face, like where to point their eyes, and really, really nitty-gritty stuff that a lot of games either just don't pick up on or really have to exaggerate because you're trying to push an actor's performance through the veil of CGI cartoon bullshit in order to break through. But the digital acting in this game is often very subtle, and pulling off a subtle, understated performance in a video game that's really hard to do. It's hard to do because it's animation. Expressions, movements tend to have to be quite exaggerated in order to get them to register. So I think this game does an incredible job on that level. I do think there is an issue that might rear its ugly head on PS5, and it might not come to light until the PS5 version has been out in the wild for a couple of weeks, and that is on the PC version. And I know from looking at Reddit and the Steam forums and a couple of other places, I know I'm not the only person who's getting this. There seems to be a bit of a memory leak issue or something going on, where if you run the game for more than 3 or 4 hours, it starts to chug. All of a sudden, things just take a bit longer to load in. There's a lot of stuttering, and the game just stops running very smoothly. And it's usually fixed if you just stop the game and restart it, or restart the PC if you want to be dramatic. So because that's happening after you've had the game running for a few hours, again, I'm not a developer, I don't know, but on a basic level, if game on for too long, game gets choppy. Now, this would seem to be a bit of a memory issue, and given how limited that pool is, in particular on the console side of things, I worry that the PS5 version of the game is going to be hampered with this. If this issue translates over to the console side, and it's not a given because they are completely different beasts, and there might be something going on the PC side that is very specific to how Windows handles API calls or something. I don't know. But if this is an issue that carries over, it'll probably be worse on the console side. So it'll be interesting to see if the PS5 version performs well, but also if it consistently performs well once it's been running for a little while. And if it doesn't have that issue, honestly, as far as I'm concerned, the PS5 will be the definitive place to play. I know a lot of people insist that games like this have to be controlled with keyboard and mouse, otherwise it's compromised in some way. How can you possibly enjoy this game using a controller? And I get that to some extent, because you've got a lot of options. It's Dungeons and Dragons, so the game has to account for almost anything that the player can think of to get out of any particular situation, because it's trying to simulate the role of a dungeon master, right? So it can't account for everything, but Baldur's Gate 3 accounts for a lot, which is and quite surprisingly so. It's very, very good. So you've got a lot of kind of options that have to be represented with icons on screen, and when you're running with controller support, this comes up in the form of radial menus. You can customize the radial menus to your heart's content. There are a lot of them, and it does get a bit fiddly when you're selecting stuff. Also, the way you select characters is slightly fiddly. It's fiddly. You're taking a style of game that works best on keyboard and mouse and kind of jamming it into a place where it works well on a controller. So obviously compromises have to be made. But Larian are very good at this. Their previous games, Divinity Original Sin, the Enhanced Edition, Divinity Original Sin 2, they work perfectly well with controller support. Baldur's Gate 3 is spiritually, this might be slightly controversial, but I would say it's as much as it's a sequel to Baldur's Gate, I would also say it's spiritually very much like Divinity Original Sin 3, to be honest. This is not a bad thing. You know, this is why Larian were the perfect people to make Baldur's Gate 3 in the modern age. But yeah, I think running the game with a controller works perfectly fine. So experientially, I think people are going to be surprised with how well that works. Isometric RPGs heading to console have been a bit of a mixed bag in the past, but Baldur's Gate 3, I think it nails it, to be honest. And I actually kind of prefer having direct control over where the character goes, you know, rather than just clicking somewhere and watching the party go there, because I'm going to say it, right? Forgive me, don't throw things at me, but I think it's better for my immersion, right? To be able to feel like I'm actually walking around the world in a physical sense, rather than just kind of like directing the action from on high. So in those terms, I think playing the game with a controller for me is definitive. Not for everyone, granted, but you know, horses for courses, innit? The upshot is, I think experientially, I don't think the PS5 version is going to be compromised whatsoever, based on how it runs with a controller on PC. Visually, based on our guesswork here, I think it's going to look fine on PS5. There may be some performance issues down the road. Games come out and they don't work as well as they do after a few patches, and that may well be the case with the PS5 version of this. Long story short, I don't think anyone playing the PS5 version needs to have FOMO about how it runs on a big PC. I think it's going to be a dynamite RPG for PS5. You know, I said a while back that I think Baldur's Gate 3 might be Larian's Witcher 3 moment, you know, where that studio goes nuclear, the conditions are right, you know, lots of eyes are on Baldur's Gate 3 at the moment, and with Starfield being an Xbox exclusive, I think there's a lot of scope here for Baldur's Gate to become like the big RPG for PS5 players this year, which, you know, in a year with a new Final Fantasy, seems like a mad thing to say, but given how much buzz there is around this game, you know, who knows? But look, wherever you play, whatever you play, 2023's been a pretty fucking good year, innit? Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to get back to playing this in big, wide, fuck-off-o vision, as is my right by capitalism. Catch you later.